Thursday evening. My name is Mike McKenna. I'm the headmaster of Rockbridge Academy. I want to welcome you all to Dr. Gordon's presentation this evening, We Make Media and Media Make Us. Before we begin, let me go ahead and pray for us. Our great God and Heavenly Father, we do thank you for your kindness towards us in Christ. We thank you for your kindness towards us in Providence, for calling us to this place. Thank you for our safe travels for Dr. Gordon and all in the audience. We pray that you would guide and bless our discussion this evening, that we might be enriched, that we might be challenged to think about your word anew. We pray that you would give clarity to Dr. Gordon in speech and thought, and may we glorify you in our thoughts, words, and deeds this evening. For it's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gordon to you. He is ordained in the Presbyterian Church of America. Currently, he's a professor at Grove City College, where he teaches courses in religion, Greek, humanities, and media ecology. If you're wondering what media ecology is, I'm sure he'll explain that to you shortly. Prior to Grove City, he was a professor of New Testament at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Massachusetts. He also served for 9 years as the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashua, New Hampshire. Dr. Gordon has contributed to a number of books, study Bibles, scholarly and popular journals, and his 2 books, which are on sale in the narthex, are Why Johnny Can't Preach and Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns. I'm currently reading Why Johnny Can't Preach, enjoying it immensely. I was going to ask Dr. Gordon if he was from New Jersey, because he says things so directly and to the point. I'm just finding a kindred spirit here. But I can't, as a music major, I can't wait to get to Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns and finally find out the answer why. He's graduated from Roanoke College, Westminster Theological Seminary, and Union Theological Seminary. He and his wife, Diane, live in Grove City, and they have 2 daughters. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gordon.
It's nice to be here. Nice not to have had weather problems in the process of getting here. And it's good to see some older faces that I can reconnect with, and then some newer ones also. It's a pleasure to be with you for that reason. It's kind of fun to take a 13-and-a-half-week class and to jam it into 60 minutes. I can't speak as rapidly as people from New Jersey, and if I could, that might help. So what we will do is we will have a season of Q&A afterwards, and that way I don't have to feel the obligation to cover everything that I might, but I can scratch where you're itching afterwards, I hope. And so we want to look tonight as a general public, not the teachers tomorrow, but as general public with at this topic that we make media and media make us. And let me begin, if I may, with a definition. When you and I hear the substantive expression, the media, ordinarily when people talk about the media, they are abbreviating a larger expression, and they normally mean something like the news media or the entertainment media. Or even though they say the media, what they mean is a given group of people who use certain media to accomplish certain things. When media ecologists use the expression media, we actually mean media. With no adjective, right? And so there is a story told by some law enforcement officials in the Southwest some years ago, a decade or more. There was a notorious smuggler who had been in prison in the United States on more than one occasion for smuggling drugs and firearms from Mexico into the United States. And his photograph and name were published everywhere in the law enforcement community, and every time he tried to cross the border from Mexico into the United States, the people saw his photograph, they recognized him, and they searched his truck to see what he was smuggling this time. And so they opened it up, There was old furniture, the kind you might have gotten at the Salvation Army. A couple old television sets and these kinds of things. They brought the drug-sniffing dogs in, nothing. They searched the place for firearms, nothing. And so they had to let him go. And this continued every 3 or 4 months for a space of 2 years. And they were very frustrated because they knew he was up to no good. And they couldn't catch him. So they finally called the FBI, right here, right? And they had a weekend off from surveilling for NSA, so they were free. So they called the FBI agent, they told him what they knew, and the guy says, well, give me 48 hours, I'll get back to you. And of course he went after it with the typical FBI, this is to be methodologically done, scientifically done, we'll catch the guy in 48 hours. So 48 hours later, he calls the person down on the border between Mexico and Texas. And says, I figured it out, we know what he's smuggling. The guy said, what? He said, trucks. He was bringing illegal trucks into the United States. And they were looking for something else, right? No drugs, couldn't find drugs anywhere, couldn't find firearms, and he just kept bringing truck after truck into the United States. Well, media ecologists look at media the way the FBI guy did at trucks. We don't really care what you put in the truck. Not as media ecologists. Now, as humans, we care, right? But as a discipline, media ecology studies media themselves, not what people do with them. And we raise the question of how the humane environment is changed by the introduction or deletion of a particular medium. And so we begin then with the most basic observation of all cultural anthropology, which is that we make tools and tools make us. There is a reciprocity, a dialogue, if you will, between a culture's tools and the culture itself. When you make a tool and introduce it into a culture, the culture is not the same as it was before. Any biologists here who teach environmental science at the school here or elsewhere? One of the things that all environmentalists and ecologists teach is that ecological change is never additive. It is never additive. If you add a new species of plant or animal to a forest, you do not have the old forest plus those new species, because it alters the ecological balance. Snowshoeing and hiking up in Vermont and northern New Hampshire for years, noticed once on my trip up there what looked like something the size of a German Shepherd or larger, but it was moving like a cat. It crossed the road on the Kankanagas Highway in front of me one evening when I was driving up there. Asked a friend, he said, oh, it's a mountain lion. We found their tracks and they're scattered, there's no question they're back. 2 years later, I was snowshoeing up in the northeast kingdom of Vermont, and I was breaking trail, I was in the front. And of course we saw moose tracks, we always do in the winter. And then I saw a track, good 4.5 inches, and it was plainly feline, going through the snow across the track. Man my age, my size gets nervous. I have many aspirations in life, one of which is not to be mountain lion lunch. Okay? Now, the mountain lions are just beginning to come back to northern New England. It'll take years before they will affect the environment, but they will eventually change it. When you introduce the mountain lion to those forests, you do not have the previous forest plus a mountain lion, because he will be a predator of certain other species. And so some other species will compete with them for food and will be predated by the mountain lion. And so the whole forest will change. It will even go down to the flora also, not just fauna, because some of the things that are now eating certain plants, if they get eaten, those plants are going to flourish. So ecological change is never additive. You never have what you had before and an additional thing in it. Everything changes. And when you introduce a new tool to any culture, you alter the culture, sometimes in surprising ways. So I mentioned there for you a handful. The reason the Greeks did not build the aqueducts and the Romans had to do it is because the Greeks were media ecologists. And the Greeks knew that it would have unintended consequences. And of course, the primary change was social structure. In ancient cultures, the town well was the center of social life. We're 85 to 90% water. We can live without food for quite a while, perhaps uncomfortably. But we have to have water. Even the stories of Jesus in the Gospels often have him needing someone at a well. And the aqueduct altered forever the nature of town and village life in Roman culture, though it wasn't intended to do anything but bring water. But it changed where people went to get water, and therefore completely changed the matrix of social relationships in the culture. The Roman highways were as significant as any military excursions the Roman Empire ever undertook. Because without highways made of stone, you could not move men and material from one place to another. You couldn't have an international empire such as Rome had without roads, something as prosaic as roads. The violin was the most prominent instrument in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was replaced not because the guitar is a new instrument, it's a very old instrument. In fact, our English word guitar is from the Greek kithara, which appears in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Some form of a wooden box with strings attached in some way goes back to biblical times. So the guitar was not a new instrument, and it wasn't really, in some ways, a superior instrument to the violin. But once you had electricity, you could amplify it. And now if you wanted to fill a concert hall with music, you didn't need 14 violins, 8 violas, 8 double-string basses, 7 celli, 3 French horns and a partridge and a pear tree. All you needed was Billy Gibbons and his Dirty Stratocaster. Right? ZZ Top, just 3 people, and a lot of amplification. Right? And so you've altered forever what people entering our culture thinks music sounds like just by having electric amplification to your instruments. It changes everything. My first exposure to media ecology was when I was adding a room to my house in Massachusetts once, and we were adding a deck on after I added the room on, and my wife came out, and I had done some measuring to figure where to dig the holes in the ground for a 10-foot by 14-foot deck so that I could put sonotubes in the ground, pour concrete in, and make the foundation. And I was a little perplexed, by the way, because I knew it was 14 by 10, so I could run my strings out. But you can get a trapezoid that way. You can get a 10 by 14 trapezoid that won't look good. And it will not impress your neighbors. And so I pondered, and finally, an epiphany from 10th grade occurred. Plane geometry, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I started measuring. I would temporarily put those strings and the posts into the ground, and whenever the diagonal equaled the other one, we could dig our holes. So pleased with myself, I started to dig. And my wife came out and looked in the backyard and said, "What are you making?" And I said, "Calluses." Right? Because every tool we use alters us. And so we make tools, and tools make us. God made us material beings, and by the way, he said it's very good that we're material beings, so take that, Greeks. He said that we were material beings and good, and because we are material beings, every interaction with the material world changes us in some ways. We make tools, and they make us. I've offered in my service on the technology committee at Grove City College a little alternative to our current way of doing things. For the last roughly 30 years, Carrie, it was true when you guys were there, students on entering get, quote, a free laptop. Now, of course, you and I know nothing's free. Right? But they roll it into the tuition cost and, quote, give it to them. And then, if that weren't gift enough, 4 years later when they graduate, they give them this digitized doorstop, because after 4 years, what good is it? Now, the technology committee on which I serve there hasn't met for 11 years. The reason is I'm on it. And the learned that 11 years ago. I simply asked, with all the innocence of a newborn, if instead of spending $4,000 per student on a laptop, we got a group rate on the great books of the Western world and the entire 9 volumes Oxford English Dictionary, and allowed our students to take that with them when they graduated, which students would be the wiser students after 10 years? Well, that was the last time the committee met. Suits me fine, I have other things to do with my time. But to suggest that books that old might be as valuable as technologies that are brand new was simply reprehensible. Polite people don't raise those questions. We make tools and they make us. The tools that surround us shape us to be different people. The old saying was, for a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's fun to watch it when men get new power tools. Right? We had a list of honeydews that our wives wanted us to do. And then once we've got a new tool, we think of all sorts of interesting projects to do. Because now we have a tool that will do them. And so what we needed in the home, what we wanted in the home, what we desired in the home, is now serving the tool. Because this tool can do this. Right? If you get a router, you start joining everything. Before long, you're joining your kids to each other. Mortars and tendon joints and so forth. Everything. Once you've got a router, everything has to be routed. So what happens then is every tool that a culture makes both reflects the values of that culture and shapes the values of the culture. And as we discussed primarily digital media, though that goes back to orality, manuscript handwriting, typographic printing press, radio, television, and so forth. But as we deal with primarily in the next 2 days, digital technologies, it's very important to recognize that we make tools and tools make us. That fundamental cultural anthropological reality is what informs media ecology. And so I suggest that when we evaluate our tools, including media, and they are tools, that we always ask 2 questions. What does the tool do for us, and what does the tool do to us? Engineers ask the first question, and God bless them. Right? We love them for giving us tools that do for us things that we want to have done. It's not their job to ask, what does it do to us? But every tool we use does something for us and something to us. If we return to my backyard and the shovel, if I say as a media ecologist that what it does for us is it puts holes in the ground, what it does to us is calluses our hands, that's not a value judgment. It's simply descriptive. I played handball in college, and we wanted our hands to be as hard as they possibly could be. Because the ball comes off your hand faster if you have calloused hands than if you have soft hands. Possibly a brain surgeon wouldn't want calloused hands. But it's not a value judgment to say that a shovel calluses your hand. We're just describing what it does to us. Whether you want it to do that is your business, I suppose, right? But every tool in the use thereof does something to us as well as something for us, and media are among them. And so here's our definition of a medium. Edward Case professed to be a medium. He professed to be able to allow the living to speak to the deceased because he was a medium between them. So anything that permits one human to connect to and commune with another human is a medium. It's between them. It's the thing between them that allows them to connect. And so speaking to you in the English language is a medium. It's the vehicle by which what's in my little head goes into your head. And it doesn't grow on trees. Some humans speak another language. An 8-year-old boy in Paris tonight is probably speaking French. And an 8-year-old boy in the United States tonight is probably speaking something approximating English. And so French doesn't grow on trees. English doesn't grow on trees. These are tools that are shaped by cultures for many, many years. And then once we have those tools, the use of those tools shapes us, makes us different than what we were before. So every tool that we look at, we have to raise two questions, not one. What does it do for us, and what does it do to us? If Marianne Wolf at MIT or at Tufts is correct, what reading does to us is far more important than what it does for us. We think it contains information and knowledge, and in some cases, understanding or wisdom. But it rewires our brain. The reading brain is a different brain than a non-reading brain. We are not born with the ability to read. The reason it took us all so long to learn to read is not because reading is conceptually hard. It's not like the fundamental theory of the calculus. It's not baffling. But it does require three of the major lobes of the brain to have synaptic pathways built between them. And we are born without those synaptic pathways. So obviously there's the conceptual part of the brain that says bread and means this loaf warming out of the oven. But in other languages they could say artos or some other term. And so we associate that thing with the sound bread. But then to convert it to reading, the visual part of the brain has to be able to reproduce the sound. And then that has to connect to the conceptual part. So three disconnected parts of our human neurology have to connect for us to, quote, learn to read. But guess what? Lo and behold, once they have connected for that purpose, they remain connected for other purposes. And so those three parts of the brain that are now connected through neurological pathways remain connected for any other task that may benefit from their being so connected. And that's why your observation is correct when you say, I have a hunch that people who read a lot are smarter than people who do not. By which you do not mean merely that they read a book about something that the other person did not read a book about. What you mean is that when both of them, the reader and the non-reader, encounter a problem that neither of them has encountered before, the reader is more likely to figure it out before the non-reader. And you're absolutely right. Because parts of the brain that can work synergistically together, that were not connected before, are now connected. And they can throw their shoulders together behind a common cause. And so what reading does for us in altering our brain, or to us, in my opinion, is far more important than what it does for us. It makes us different human beings than we were before. And that's the case with all of our human neurology, all the way through life. They call it neuroplasticity. Some of them call it neurogenesis, whether it's the brain flexing, neuroplasticity, or whether they call it neurogenesis, the brain creating, generating its own synaptic pathways. It does it all the way to the day we die. It's a moving target. By the way, this accounts for some things that you're wondering how to account for before. Take a poet or a composer that you initially did not particularly care for. I'm working on Emily Dickinson now with the help of Helen Benham, and I'm having a delightful time, by the way. Almost all of us have some poets and some composers who, when we first were exposed to them, we didn't particularly care for. And then at some point we go, hey, you know that Brahms? He's growing on me. That's pretty good stuff. This line Deutsches Requiem, this isn't so bad. And what has happened is our neurology has adjusted to Brahms. And so what it is that he's trying to do with the orchestra in front of him, that we couldn't quite figure out before, at some point it starts to sound musical to us. In extreme cases, by the way, is Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Right? For many of us, when we first hear it, we say, that isn't music. Because if Aaron Copland is right, the foundational acoustic property of music is rhythm. And in some cultures develop melody, and in some develop harmony, and some create different instruments with different timbres, and some create lengthy pieces that actually have form. But rhythm is at the heart of all of it. So one of the first things we listen for is rhythm. It's as though the foot is just dying to find the rhythm. I got rhythm. It's just dying to live. So Stravinsky, in the opening measures, has what? A 12/4 or 12/6. He has a 3/4 and a 4/4. He's got 3 different time signatures in the opening movements. And of course, your foot's about to spin off like Linda Blair's head in The Exorcist. It's trying to find a downbeat, and there's stuff going everywhere. And it just doesn't seem musical, but remember, it's the pagan rite of spring. And he's trying to find a musical way of expressing what polytheism looks and sounds like. Competing deities that are not one, the way the true and living God is one. Deities who fight with each other over Ulysses. Right? And so the way to do it is to create this wild, apparently cacophonous thing. And once you realize he's doing it, and you keep forcing yourself to listen to it, at some point you say, I'm not ready to say it's my favorite, but I think it is music. It's because having tried to listen to it enough times, you eventually adjust to it, and it no longer sounds merely like noise. It's a wonderful thing. Neuroplasticity is a wonderful, wonderful reality. And it reflects this reality that we make tools and tools make us. The tools that we use shape us constantly. And so what we study when we ask our two questions, what does a tool do for us, including media tools, communication tools, what they do for us and what they do to us, we're asking how they alter the humane environment. Which forms of life thrive and which forms of humane life are suppressed? When you add the mountain lion to the woods of northern Vermont, which forms of life grow and which ones do not? And I don't know. I have no way of predicting. I don't work in that arena. But I can virtually guarantee that if I ever have grandchildren, and once I'm fishing with Simon Peter in another world, if my grandson goes up and hikes those mountains that I've hiked, they will not be the same mountains. There will be forms of life there that are not there now, and forms of life that are currently there will probably be gone. I certainly hope that the mountain lion doesn't eat the painted trillia or the scarlet trillia, because they're beautiful flowers. For some reason, the painted trillia, little white ones, grow on the south side of that mountain that I hike, and the scarlet trillia grow on the north side. I have no way of accounting for that. Sun, snow, rain, a forest fire a century ago, I have no way of knowing. All I know is I've never seen a painted trillium on the north side of the mountain, and I've never seen a scarlet trillium on the south side. Within 200 yards of the peak, you've got different flowers on one side than on the other side. Have no way of accounting for it. But it's possible that they could all be gone if the mountain lion wants to eat them. And I prefer that it eat the flowers than reap the vegetables, but we just don't know what they will do. And so some forms of human life are enhanced by our use of certain media, and other forms of human life are not. So if we call it media ecology, we're saying, how does the introduction into our environment of this or that medium alter that environment in such a way that certain forms of human experience flourish and certain forms of human experience in life do not flourish, but have to fight just to hold on? And tomorrow with the teachers we'll talk about a number of the specific realities that are there. So when Marshall McLuhan, in one of his major books, Understanding Media, subtitled Extensions of Man, when he called them extensions of man, he argued that every medium tended to extend one aspect of what it meant to be human. The telephone extends the ear. Now, it doesn't materially get bigger, but people who could only communicate at earshot can now pick up a telephone and call people miles away. It alters the humane environment. And in the process of doing that, it alters forever the seesaw of proximate and distant, doesn't it? Because the once distant is now proximate, and the once proximate is therefore distant. It's what McLuhan called the global village. What happens when television brings the globe that you're living on. You now notice things happening on the other side of the globe, and you don't notice that Mrs. Smith up the street has come home from the hospital and needs someone to make a casserole. So you're preoccupied with or thinking about a natural disaster on the opposite side of the globe about which you could do nothing. And right up the street is someone about whom you could do something, and you're entirely unaware that she needs your care. She now lives without your assistance, and you live without the blessing of assisting her. Your life has changed. Just because that medium has called your attention to one thing and not another thing. It's completely altered the nature of what village means. And that's why it's not surprising that people like Wendell Berry have shown up when they showed up. Because as someone who was reared in the middle part of the 20th century, his whole life saw village and community change. The whole relation of proximate and distant was changed by electricity. That's what it does. And so we know all sorts of things about what is distant to us and very little about what is proximate to us. Even with a middle-aged brain, which as you know doesn't remember much of anything, even with a middle-aged brain, I can kind of close my eyes and walk around the neighborhood I grew up in outside of Richmond, Virginia, and name the last name of the families on every house, and sometimes each of the children. People within 2 houses of me in Grove City, I have no idea what their name is. It's a fundamentally different world. Now, I know some people here. I know Mike McKenna. But I don't know the name of the guy who lives 2 houses from me. Right? So travel and electricity and so forth have altered that which we're aware of and that which we aren't aware of. All media extend one part of what it means to be human and atrophy the other part. And what we're trying to find is, if not perfect balance, symmetry. Growing up, spending weekends on the Chesapeake Bay, for instance, we used to always find ourselves amused as children by the fiddler crabs. And we called them that because they had one claw on one side of their body that seemed perfectly the right size for a crustacean of that size. And then on the other side, they had a claw that was as big as the crustacean itself, like it was carrying a big fiddle. Right? They were highly asymmetrical. Right? Something had gone wrong. Darwin took a nap. Something happened. And this crazy asymmetry occurred. Plus, they didn't produce much music out of that fiddle. So it didn't even do that good. So we are trying to find perfect balance necessary, but at least a kind of humane symmetry. What kind of sensibilities reflect the image of God more than others? And the use of which tools enhances which of those sensibilities? That's the question we raised. My students are now so distracted by their digital technologies that are constantly alarming them that they are distracted when I'm not distracted. They come to see me in my office to talk about something, and my phone on the desk, it's not even on the desk anymore, I put it on the shelf somewhere. There it sits, and when it sat on my desk, it would ring. And it would ring a second time. And ordinarily on the third ring, they'd say, Dr. Gordon, your phone's ringing. As though I were deaf or daft or both. And I said, I understand that the phone is ringing. You are here now. Through the miracle of voicemail, I can get my message later. But they find it unsettling that something rang and I didn't salute it. It's almost as though it's a little creepy. Right? A person who can resist an alarm. Right? I might go into the post office and shoot everyone. People like that are dangerous. You'll note that they're just accustomed to constant distraction. And so they don't realize that they are distracted. And attention span, especially what we call executive attention span, is one of the great casualties of the digital world. We're so used to things screaming and alarming at us that we don't notice the understated, the body language, the posture, the little ways that humans conveyed all sorts of rich material to one another that didn't scream is lost. If it doesn't scream, it isn't heard. And I think that, by the way, is an enormous loss both for our intellectual development, but above all for our social and moral development. I don't know how we could possibly feed the hungry without noticing that they're hungry. I don't know how we can comfort the grieving if we do not notice that they are grieving. And so if we become less attentive and don't notice smaller, subtler shifts in one another because we don't know how to notice that because our heads are down like this, then we won't be able to help one another on certain occasions. Fortunately, in a fallen world, not every day is horrible. But a number of them are. Most people have a few moments in life where something very, very threatening comes to their attention. And when that has happened to you, and when it has happened to me, we all go through this same curious phase for 2 or 3 or 4 days that amounts to something like this, doesn't matter. Part of us feels that we need to talk to someone because we're overwhelmed. We learn that our mother has cancer, or mom and dad are considering a divorce, or that we have cancer, or that our daughter does. Part of us feels the need to talk, but then the other part of us says, I need to wrap myself around this before I talk to anyone. I'm not ready to talk to anyone. Right? And you recall that struggle, where you're in that spot in between. Part of you feels like you need to talk to another human being, and another part of you says, I'm not ready to talk. And you know what gets you over the hurdle? 9 times out of 10. Someone looks you in the eye and says, Jimmy, is everything going okay? You seem a little distracted. And at that point, your eyes mist and your lower lip quivers a little bit, and you say, well, I just found out that my wife has cancer. Right? What pulls you out, right, is that another human notices something just a little different, long before you beat or alarmed or demanded their attention. And if we become inattentive to those subtler, smaller ways that other human beings convey sadness before they're even ready to convey sadness, or convey fear or anxiety before they're even ready to convey fear or anxiety, then we cannot be like Christ, who noticed all that. Think of how often it said that he perceived, fill in the blank. And he perceived. Because he noticed. And he had the capacity to look beyond what shouted at him. But now we're constantly competing with things that shout. And so we are not extending, I would say, our capacity for human sympathy. That capacity is not being extended. The big mouths get our attention, and the small mouths do not. If you've got an alarm, you get an attention. And if you don't have an alarm, you don't. And so what's being extended is McClelland's way of looking at it. Which of our various human faculties are extended by certain medium and not so much by other things? So different ones do different things. Orality, for instance, promotes memory. If you and I were still living in an oral culture before handwriting was invented, the fundamental intellectual task was memory. You couldn't write anything down. The fundamental use of the human mind prior to the 2nd millennium BC was to remember things. If you, for instance, were going to raise horses for a living, and 15 miles away was a person reputed to be a good horse farmer, and you went to spend a day with him, and you asked him how much exercise he gave his horses, and what sort of food, and how often in the day, and how much water. you not only had to try to figure out the wisdom that he had, but you had to have some way of remembering what he said. Because you couldn't call him back on the cell phone the next day. You might have one shot at this person, one day in your entire life. And so oral cultures are highly mnemonic cultures. They develop all sorts of mnemonic devices to remember what they've learned. But they're not highly rational cultures. Because they're using their intellectual powers to remember what they've heard, not to critically evaluate it. Printing press cultures, of course, by contrast, become highly rational. Because reading a book, you can say, oh, I see what Gordon says right here in chapter 1. And then over in chapter 3 say, I think the little rascal just contradicted what he said in chapter 1. Let's just go back and sit. Right? Just think of how that cultivates rationality. You can even put a bookmark and say, well, let's just check that with Encyclopedia Britannica. Right? So what happens is printed material, especially the printing press, cultivates human rationality in a way that other forms didn't. And so different media extend different aspects of what it is to be human. Orality extends memory. Typography, the printing press, extends rationality. Different aspects of what it is to be human are extended by different media. The use of them simply makes us different sorts of people. The manuscript, once they started writing by hand, the manuscript promoted a communal attention to important texts. When we read the Bible, read the New Testament, it says that they were reading from Isaiah. We tend to think that that culture is like ours, that they had books. They didn't. They had scrolls written on animal skins. Think of how expensive books were when they were etched out onto animal skins in a long scroll. I think the copper Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea, for instance, is 38 or 42 feet long. And that's just Isaiah. Right? So take the whole Bible and put it on a scroll and see how long it is. When your Jewish friends dedicate their Torah scroll, which is the second most important day of the synagogue's life, the first is when they first meet, and then they raise money, and they have a Torah scroll. And once their Torah scroll is there, every day, every Saturday, someone reads from the 5 books of Moses from their Torah scroll. It costs about $1.5 million to have the 5 books of Moses reproduced by hand on a manuscript like that. It's very expensive, extremely expensive. So manuscript cultures were not cultures where people owned books. Only wealthy people had them. And rather what happened was, in a manuscript culture, the most important cultural artifacts were committed to animal skin so that they could be preserved. And the community's job was to mull it over and to think about it and to talk about it. We have roughly 5,000 manuscript portions of evidence for the Greek New Testament. About 5,100. 3,500 of those are not New Testaments. They begin with Matthew 1 and go through Revelation 22. 3,500 of those are lectionaries. Because before the printing press, in most places in Europe, even a local church did not have an entire Bible. It had the Psalms, an Old Testament lesson, a gospel lesson, and an epistle lesson for each of the 52 Sundays of the year. We called it a lectionary. And part of the liturgy of the Christian church was we read certain passages on the 3rd Sunday after Advent or the 4th Sunday after. And all other Christians were having someone read the same passages. And then when you met one another in the market or going to the well, you discussed what was the common Christian reading in the common lectionary for the 51st or the 52nd Sunday of the year. And so in those cultures, you didn't do any private Bible reading. That wasn't until the printing press. The scriptures belonged to the Christian church. Just as when Paul first sends his letters to the church, right? To the churches at Galatia, right? And some runner runs to the place and takes Paul's letter and stands in front of the church and reads it to them. The community owns that property. But then the whole community could talk about it. I haven't written on this topic, but at some point I want to write on the fact that the 60-odd times that the New Testament says it is written, Gagrop time, it did not merely mean it is inspired. There are passages that say that, and I think the Old Testament is inspired, you do too. But Gagrop in manuscript culture also conveyed social authority. This is so important. We have written it. Which is not the same as when you take a pen out and grab a post-it note and jot something down on it. Right? For them to say Gagrop died, it is written, meant this is serious business. And you could discuss as a community this small body of common wisdom that you wrote in a manuscript in a very different way than we just go home and have books all over the house. And I don't know if you read the same books I have. A friend of mine sent me a lovely picture of his year and a half year old baby. I guess that one's 19 months now. They're in Philadelphia. I'm sure Craig staged this, but their little Evelyn is lying on her back in the living room, reading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. She's a pressing little thing. I don't think Evelyn has actually read it. But if you were in a church that used the common lectionary, you could talk to any other Christian you met through the week and know what Old Testament lesson, what gospel, and what epistle lesson had been read publicly, and you could talk about it. Right? Very, very different thing. Manuscript culture encourages communal reflection on a sacred literature. That's what it does, because we didn't have our own books, no private reading. The fundamental difference between how we read the Psalms and how the biblical people did is precisely there. We read them in our private devotions. The Israelites in the first 15 centuries of the Christian church never encountered it privately and only encountered it publicly. That's a different way of reading it, isn't it? It's a fundamental. The Psalms have gone from what we share and talk about and mull over to something that does something about me and Jesus. It's a fundamentally different kind of thing, and it's just because of the difference in media. The most remarkable passage in the New Testament for a media ecologist is a passage that no one else cares about one bit, and that's fine. And it's the 8th chapter of Acts. Philip sees a guy in a chariot coming up from Ethiopia, and he's reading, as you know, from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. And he's raising the question about who does Isaiah write? Is it the prophet writing about himself or somebody else? And of course, that's what most of us do. We want to see how the question gets answered. But the media ecologist, I'm saying, where did he get his hands on the manuscript? How did he get a scroll of Isaiah? And the text answers my question, doesn't it? What was his profession? He was the treasurer of Candace, the queen of Ethiopia. Because when people gave expensive gifts of state, then and now, someone had to catalog it. Because if the person who gave it to you visits, you have to bring it out and put it in a prominent place. It would be like being a museum curator today. Imagine you finish your art degree at Rose City College, you go off to MoMA in New York City, and you become the curator of the Museum of Modern Art. And you invite some friends over to your house for tea or a cocktail on the weekend, and you happen to have a Cézanne on the wall. Where'd you get that? This guy snuck off with my Isaiah scroll. He figured the queen wouldn't miss it for a while. So he had access to this extremely expensive thing. And had he not been the treasurer of Wart, he'd have never had it. So I know it's terribly boring to you, but to me, absolutely fascinating. We try to figure out what it would have cost in the first century to reproduce the entire Greek New Testament, all 27 books. And they said roughly it would have cost the annual wage of 40 Roman centurions. That's assuming you can find 40 military men somewhere who are willing to give their entire annual salary for a book, for 1/40th of a book. So I don't know what our average GI makes today. Let's say it's 40 grand, 40 times that. Woo! Do the numbers. You're back to your $1.5 million to get the Torah scroll. Very, very expensive kind of a thing. So manuscript creates this sense of the holy, the same way our Jewish friends have their Torah scroll in the front of their synagogue. And every Saturday they roll it to the next text, and someone, why there, Elohim, he goes through and reads it. Right? This is their sacred manuscript, and they reflect on it together as a community. That's what it does. So it's a very, very different thing from us. It's not like a printing press culture when inexpensive paper makes book publication cheap and therefore common. In the manuscript cultures, probably less than 4% of the population would have been literate. Right? Why know how to read if there's nothing to read? It's pointless. And they said that within about 125 years of the printing press in Europe, 85% of Europe was literate. So you've changed the culture. We're not commonly discussing a sacred text that we've all read from the same place on Saturday or Sunday. Each of us is reading his own book or her own book somewhere. That's what happens. It's just a different kind of a thing that happens when that's the case. The printing press, of course, then, by contrast, promotes rationality. And when I was chatting with the Library of Congress, James Billington, once he visited Grove City, they're the most remarkable people in the world. I asked him at one point, do you mind telling me what your job description is? And Dr. Billington says, well, Professor Gordon, it's a little embarrassing. I have a budget right now, $42 million annually, and I don't answer to anyone. That's good work if you can get it. Now, he does have a staff of about 4 PhDs and then clerical staff to assist them. And ostensibly, if a congressman asked them to research a matter, they would be able to research it. But they do whatever they want. And of course, in part of the conversation, I had to ask him, what do you think the most significant thing is that humans ever invented? And I almost hugged him around the neck when he told me, but I didn't want to embarrass him. Right? He said the most significant invention ever was the codex. Because as long as manuscripts were bound in a scroll, you couldn't paginate them. If you couldn't paginate them, you couldn't have a table of contents or an index. But once you cut pieces of animal skin and put them into what you might call pages and bound them in the back, now you can put numbers on them and tables of content and indices. And he said human rationality went wild after the codex. And that's even before the printing press. This is still back in the era of manuscript, when you moved from a long piece of skin that you wrote on to something bound that we had leaves or pages in it. He said it changed human rationality forever. He said that led to all of the learned discussions of the medieval period. All of the great universities that came up in the medieval period were not just manuscript universities, but they were codex universities versus scrolls. It's crazy, isn't it? To think that just the form in which the words are written on animal skin could alter so much. And he said that's what it was. So the funny thing is, not only do most people not think that that's a consequential invention, but when I tell them what his answer was, they still don't know what I'm talking about. So it not only does not occur to most of us that the codex is that significant, we don't know what a codex is. And the Library of Congress thinks it's the most significant thing ever done. The printing press creates both rationality, but unfortunately a kind of individuality, because book reading can become a very private thing. Some of us consider it blessedly private, wonderfully private. I sometimes take a small volume of poetry with me when I'm hiking, and if I'm soloing and no one joins me, I sit down at some point and read it, and just enjoy it. Very private kind of a thing to do. That's very different than in manuscript culture, when manuscripts are so expensive. Whenever there's a public reading, the public is invited. Everyone reads it. Totally different way of doing it. So we become more rational through the printing press, but we also become a little bit more individualist than we would have been before. And unfortunately, I think we don't memorize poetry much. The standard line is, why memorize it? I can just read it. But readers of verse know that you go through stages, right, of understanding a poem. You read it several times to yourself, and you try to see patterns. Another thing, you have a little pencil in the margin, you're making a little margin edit. And after you've read it 5 or 6 times quietly to yourself, you venture to read it orally. Because now you're forced to make decisions about tempo and tone and mood, and whether to read it at a fast pace or a slower pace, normally slower. And so you're forced, when you read it aloud, are you not, to take another step of interpretation and understanding. But then when you memorize a poem, boy, do you learn it then. If you're memorizing even a brief poem, a 14-line Shakespearean sonnet, and you keep getting stuck on the 11th line, it's because you haven't figured the 11th line out yet. Right? At least at that point in your mind, it's negotiable. And so when you memorize it, you're forced to account for every line. It's almost impossible to memorize if you don't do that. And so a memorized poem is learned in a way that a read poem isn't, whether you're reading it with your eyes or reading it aloud. It's another stage of knowledge. And that's why some of us from time to time commit a poem to memory, because on our earlier readings of it, we thought we were onto something. And we know that we will enjoy it and learn it better if we commit it to memory. We have poetry meetings at the college every other year or so in the spring. I think they did it when you guys were there. And they sometimes invite the Greek people over. I'm a blemish on their love feasts, I think. We have students and faculty who read a poem. And the last time we did it, I had committed the 72 lines of Tennyson's Ulysses to memory and recited it from memory for them. I was the only one that recited a poem from memory that night. The others, even if it was their own, read it. And someone thanked me for it afterwards, and I said, well, you don't need to thank me. It was its own reward. I memorized the poem because I wanted to memorize the poem. This was just an excuse. It seemed like a luxury to give myself Tennyson's Ulysses. Could hardly justify it unless I had a public occasion to share it with someone else. So thanks for letting me memorize it. Because that's when you're really learning. And I fear now that we do not know poetry the way previous generations knew poetry because we don't memorize it. There's a new book out about the memorized poem. I forget the woman's name, but it's about the importance of memorizing poems. And they are learned differently when you do it that way. When photographs and images come along, which part of our humanity do they extend? Not our rationality. They're visceral. They're emotive. What Jacques Ellul wrote about propaganda in the mid-20th century, because he was a European, and all of the European places actually had departments of propaganda. That's not just a Mel Brooks film. They actually did this, right? Nowadays, of course, in our culture, the propagandists are commercial forces, not government forces. The government's too chaotic to try to do that sort of thing. But Pepsi and Nike and these people, they know exactly what they're doing. And the reason they use images and not language is because images can appeal to us emotionally without the courage of a philosophical argument. So they can move us to value certain things and even do certain things without arguing the point. Some of you saw the Nike commercial that came out last year. In the opening clip, it's about a 4 or 5 second clip of somebody doing something athletic, running, shooting a basketball or something. And then there's about a 3.5 second clip of somebody else doing something athletic, and then a 3 second, and then a 2.5, and this keeps going until towards the end, it's just one image after another. And at the end, the screen stops and goes dark, and there's a swoosh. Now, I don't know what it cost them to have some advertising firm create that, or to air it at sporting events, but there's not a word in it. Not a word. Nike's not throwing their money away. If that ad didn't sell Nike products, they would not have spent that kind of money on it. People are buying Nike products because of a commercial that hasn't one English word in it. So we dare not kid ourselves into thinking that images are inconsequential or that they do not move us. They do move us. They simply do not assume with a philosopher the courageous obligation to persuade another rational human being. So we see an image of a gentleman exiting his Mercedes, and men admire him. Women throw themselves at him. And eventually, if he has the means, he buys a Mercedes. The image made him do it. But suppose we tried the same thing in prose. Why, if Gordon had a Mercedes, he'd be 6'3", handsome, admired by men, adored by women. It's laughable, isn't it? He'd still be the same scrawny little rascal that he is. You can take the scrawny little rascal out of the Mercedes, but you could not possibly make a persuasive case with language that the automobile that you drive will make you have a more blessed and rich life, unless, like me, you own a 2006 Mustang GT. That's the one it's the only exception to that otherwise infallible principle. So what you'll notice then is that an image-based culture extends emotive expression, but not rationality. And it also, therefore, extends irrational behavior, which medical malady that we face now in high schools and universities across the United States did not exist in the 19th century before the camera. Eating disorders. Before the photograph, humans were humans, with all of their variety. In the language of the Oscar Mayer commercial, fat kids, skinny kids, kids who climb on rocks. Right? It's perfectly normal. Right? There are tall Dutchmen, and then there are God's own people. Variety is the spice of life. Right? But then once you have images, and certain commercial groups constantly give us similar images, before long we have a profound medical reality of terribly self-destructive behavior. Not because someone said, you should destroy yourself. In language, images just alter the whole thing. And so image-based culture is not the rational culture of the printing press, it's the emotive culture of image. And maybe Yahweh knew what he was doing. You shall not make any likeness of anything in heaven above, or earth beneath, or the waters beneath the earth. And you shall not bow down to them, or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Right? How do you have a God? When he says, you shall have no gods before me, you shall not make any image. How do you have a God? Do you put it in your pocket, like a smartphone? Yahweh in the pocket? How do you have a deity? You have a deity the way you worship him. And if the Israelites honor their deity, the way all the nations of the world honor theirs, then they have the other deities, and they don't have Yahweh. If a deity does not have the right to describe his own worship, he's not a deity. What would it mean to order all the universes and not order the way people worship? So if nothing else, he says, you shall do it this way because I told you to do it this way. But he expressly prohibited the use of any likeness of anything in heaven above or earth beneath or the waters beneath in religious activity. Amazing, isn't it? That God was a media ecologist that long ago. You're tempted to say he knew what he was doing. Right? That he was, as far as we know, the first media ecologist. Where not only the message, but the medium in which you put it was important. And how did the Israelites respond to the second word? When Moses finally came down off the mountain. They made a golden image. Right? And we think it was pure rebellion. It wasn't pure rebellion. In the ancient world, statuary was designed to honor deities and humans. Even today, on Monument Avenue in my native Richmond, Virginia, there are monuments, believe it or not, on Monument Avenue. Right? A.P. Hill, Jeb Stewart, and of course Robert E. Lee. Right? Now, I have to say, sadly, that most of the pigeons of West Virginia appear to be Union sympathizers. Despite what they do, you honor those that you regard as important by making statues. Right? And so the Israelites said, but if the true and living God is making a covenant with us, we have to honor him. We cannot honor him less than the Canaanites honor their deity. They make statuaries for their deity. We must not dishonor God. We must make him a statue. It was unthinkable in the 2nd millennium BC that you could have religion without a statue. It would be like having a blues convention without a guitar. You just can't do it. But for God, to know the true and living God requires language and effectively prohibits image. It's an immediate ecological commandment, and it is the first commandment. It's a remarkable thing that it is the first. If it's not correct, it's the first. So what happens then is manuscript culture does its thing, printing press culture does its thing, image-based culture does its thing, electronic cultures do their things, and in each case, to use McLuhan's language, it extends some part of what it is to be human. And then the question is, what are the most valuable and precious parts of being human? Which parts of being human make us most like the image of God? And then what environment will cultivate those things? That becomes the challenge. But the issue is not merely what's in the medium, it is also the medium itself. The medium that we employ will make us different people. It's just the way things are. Electronic cultures constantly say that whoever is calling me from a distance on my phone is more important than the young man or the young woman in my life. But my instincts tell me otherwise. That the person who is in front of me, who bears the image of the incarnate Christ, is important. And the person at a distance can wait. In one generation or a generation and a half, think of how profound that change has occurred. When my grandfather died at 92, he was a little ill for the last year before he died, a little frail. I think the last time he dove on it, he was 89. He brought back 12 dove, and I said, Pop, that's great, you got 12 dove. He says, well, I know I hit 3. The other young guys out there, when they shot dove, he'd go put them in his bag. They were about to say the guy who's 89. I'm sorry, I think it was my dove, right? I said, how many rounds did you fire? He winked and said 3. It was a good shot. He was getting 4 for 1. But Granddad, as he slowed down, there's one habit he did not change until roughly a year before he died. And that was that even when he was on his cane, if he was seated on a sofa and a woman entered the room, he leaned over onto his cane and he stood up to acknowledge her presence. No one does that anymore. Nobody acknowledges the material presence of someone who is the same species that God incarnated in. We just act as though it didn't make any difference at all. And that's what electronic technologies and digital technologies do. They make the distant proximate, and in the process they make the proximate distant. They change the ratio. Inexorably. It's unavoidable. It has to be done. So each of these various moments in the history of media shapes the human race differently. We are already moving beyond the language-based oral manuscript and printing press cultures. It's very, very difficult to discuss texts with one another. Now, in church we can. Fortunately, in church we still have our Holy Scriptures. And many people can say, I was reading in the 4th Gospel last week. I was really interested in the encounter between Jesus and Nicodemus in the 3rd chapter. And others go, oh yeah, I remember that. And we start talking, right? There's still within the religious Christian community some textuality. But culture-wide at large, it's very difficult to do it. I used to have fun disputing when friends would be building a fence. I was making a fence around my yard, or a neighbor putting a fence up. And inevitably, someone used to say 30 years ago, good fences make good neighbors. And I would always say, Well, you know that Frost didn't think that. They go, no, it's right there in the poem. That's what's even repeated. It appears twice in the poem. But remember, the poem's a dialogue between the speaker of the poem and his neighbor as they walk up and repair the fence in the spring. And he describes his neighbor as he lifts the rocks as a Neanderthal, right? And says he can never get beyond his father's saying that good fences make good neighbors. And he mentions, the speaker does, that he has no livestock now, and I have no livestock. Does he fear that an apple will fall off my tree and eat one of his apples? And so the only other repeated line in the poem is the line that comes out of the speaker's mouth, something there is that does not love or wall. And that's the first line of the poem. And that's what Frost was saying. And you can at least have that conversation in a textually based culture, because we're, at least in a textually based culture, familiar roughly with the poem. And we can have our little discussion about which reading of the poem is right than the other. But if no one's reading the same texts, there are no same texts about which we can convert. And so the manuscript cultures, according to, what's his name in the Austrian school there? Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin said that they were characterized by the intensive reading of a few texts rather than the extensive reading of a lot of texts. And so they were very familiar with a small number of texts that they could all then discuss and share their wisdom about. We read broadly, but had very little to share with one another. It's different kind of it. One of the changes I would make to worship if I were pastoring again after the 9 years I did is we would have Lectio Continua. That we would have the reading of the Word of God as a separate element of worship from just a snippet of text before I would preach. I recognize now the enormous communal value of our listening to a common text, a common sacred text, that we can then talk about through the week. I still think that's a valuable thing. Our Lutheran friends do it. Jimmy, the Lutherans still do it, don't they? The Anglicans do it. I think the Roman Catholics still do it. So the common lectionary is still in use, and there are places where it's still a normal part of the liturgical tradition and ought to be. So these various, if you think of the human as having different properties, 5 senses, 2 uses of the mind, imagination and rationality, and then all of the cultivated uses of those senses, then the question is, by our using which tools, which aspect of our humanity is likely to get cultivated? And do we wish to accept the responsibility of doing it? Now here's the illustration that some media colleges use, I like it at least, that helps us. People want us to say this medium is good and this medium is bad. They want us to be prescriptive, thou shalt, or proscriptive, thou shalt not. And we say, using a shovel causes calluses. I'm not saying to use a shovel. And I'm not saying not to use a shovel. If you play handball, you should probably use a shovel. If you're a brain surgeon, you probably ought to put the thing down. But that's what it's going to do. And we're simply trying to say, by using what media do we extend which aspects of our humanity? And the illustration some of us use is this. Right here, inside and outside, the atmospheric gases are 79% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and 1% trace gases. All the rest, just 1%. By the way, when I first learned this, I thought the Almighty might have made a mistake. Humans, after all, are oxygen breathers. Right? And I thought, maybe I would have wanted 79% oxygen and 20% nitrogen. Until I realized that it's nitrogen that permits plants to fix the carbon atoms into photosynthesize. And since we eat vegetation, and or animals that eat vegetation, it was very clever of the Almighty to give us 79% nitrogen and 20% oxygen, and all the other trace gases, just 1%. So the point is not that oxygen is good and nitrogen is bad, nitrogen is good, oxygen is bad, or that the trace gases are good or bad. The point is, for life on our planet to exist, it has to be exactly that ratio. Exactly. They say if it were off by 1%, plant life, animal life, as we know it, would not flourish. And so also, with us, as we wrestle with the various media available to us, I don't think it will be helpful to say, is this one good and this one bad? But what ratio of our exposure to them, in what amounts, will extend those aspects of our humanity that we want extended? And which ones will frustrate the extension of those more important things? That's the way we have to think. It's very frustrating for parents when I talk about media ecology, because they want us to say, thou shalt email, thou shalt not Tumblr. Thou shalt Facebook, and thou shalt not Instagram, or whatever it might be. And for us, well, 1% of the trace gases really won't cause any trouble. And you don't need more than 20% oxygen. 7 to 9% nitrogen, very, very useful. And so it's a matter of trying to find out what is done by a certain amount of exposure to different things. And all we commend and recommend is what we call experiments. For 6 months at a time, change one of your habits and see what difference it made, if any. And if you like what you got, keep going. About a decade ago, I decided for 6 months not to listen to background music. If I had free time and I wanted to listen to Brahms, I'd listen to Brahms. Or if I wanted to read Robert Frost, I'd read Robert Frost. But I wouldn't read Robert Frost with Brahms in the background. And after 6 months, I could tell I would never go back. And I never intentionally listened to background music now. Refused to do it. What I realized is I'd become so used to being distracted that I couldn't focus on anything. And I decided if the music is not good enough to put in the foreground, it's not good enough to have in the background either. If it's not worthy of my attention, it's not worthy of hearing it at all. I found I graded papers faster and more thoroughly. That anything that I did that required concentration, I did with comparative ease and greater facility. And so I continue to do those kinds of experiments from time to time, where I say, what would happen if I stopped this normal cultural habit? Now, obviously I can't avoid background music when I'm pumping gas in my car, because everywhere you go to get gas, for some reason they think, what, you missed the hole? There's no music. I'm not sure why. And I don't know why you would have to have music in Gap to buy jeans. My grandfather, for his entire life, actually managed to purchase groceries without music in the background. So you can't do anything about it there. What you can do in your own home and in your own environment is you can make these kinds of experiments and see what comes up. That's what you can do. And so that's what we recommend. So let me field some questions. You've got a general sense that what media ecology is looking at is not what the content of the medium per se. It's asking what it does to us. How does the use of a certain tool shape us? And do we wish to be shaped that way? And how do we encourage those aspects of our humanity by creating an environment in which those are likely to flourish? And how do we evade extensive exposure to those that kill those parts of our humanity that we don't want to kill? So that's the question. Let me see if I can field at least briefly some of the questions you have about how this curious discipline works. There is a Media Ecology Association website for those of you who are interested. And on my webpage, I have a Media Ecology tab, and you may be interested in that. It's just tvgordon.net. So that's my website.
As media ecologists, how do you interact with the medical research that's going on that's actually showing, as far as I've seen anyway, seems to be demonstrating a link between like attention deficit and exposure to, we'll say, screen time, and especially in young children, and then school-age children. And I mean, I don't know if you deal in that aspect of it as well at all.
Oh yeah, a lot of what we're reading is by those people. Marianne Wolf, for instance, has been the director of the neurology reading lab at Tufts University for 30-some years in the Boston area. And several years ago, she wrote Proust and the Squid, Reflections on the Reading Mind. And she took 30 years of scholarly articles and put them to where a layman could now read them, right? And so that's a large part of what her research is about, is executive attention versus alerting or alarming attention, and how the digital technologies are constantly alerting and alarming, at the expense of executive attention. And so there's been a whole lot of studies done. In fact, right now, the difficult thing about being a media ecologist is we have to bite our tongue every day because we're so tempted to say, I told you so. Because we've been saying this for 20 or 30 years, the way Solomon did, not one of whose proverbs was empirically proven. And yet all of them were true. So in other words, the problem with anecdotal evidence is only when it's quirky or idiosyncratic. But if a soft answer ordinarily turns away wrath, it may be merely anecdotal and not empirical and still true. And so some of us knew, for instance, that distracting technologies would have to destroy our capacity for deep concentration. And now it's true. I predicted years ago when they predicted that this would be the brightest generation, the digital generation, and then of course Mark Bauerlein wrote The Dumbest Generation, How Digital Technology Stupefies American Youth. We say, I told you so. Because I said, for adolescents, it is not the World Wide Web, it's the World Narrow Web. It puts adolescents into an adolescent ghetto that they cannot escape. It's like Lord of the Flies. They do not use their digital tools to discover the treasures of the West and its wisdom. They do it to avoid peer separation anxiety, which we only had to worry about in the playground on the bus. When we were physically in the presence of our peers, we didn't want to be left out. Now they're afraid somebody's texting or tweeting or YouTubing and they're being left out. And so they use it to isolate themselves from adults who they will be for 55 years. And it is a curious way to create an adult by removing them from them and isolating them in an adolescent world. So almost everything that the neurological studies are now demonstrating empirically, media ecologists have been saying for 20 years, this is what will have to happen because humans are humans. The engineer says, if we made this with a certain amount of technological capacity, and if an angel from heaven used it, what could they do? And the Calvinists say, well, you give the same capacity on there to someone who's in full revolt, rebellion against God, and what will they do with it? And so we knew of human fear and human anxiety. We've got them. And human loves and human hates. And we were always looking as humanists at media changes and saying which parts of being human will this likely encourage or discourage. And now, yes, the field of neurology is exploding. You know, the field of neurology changed 25 years ago, roughly, 20. All fields, when they change substantially, do so for one of two reasons. According to Thomas Kuhn, one reason is a new paradigm. The other reason is a new tool. Louis Pasteur couldn't have done much without a microscope. And so sometimes there's a breakthrough in a particular way of measuring something scientifically, and there's an explosion. Well, what happened 25 years ago is two things happened in neurology. First, the fMRI was just beginning, where in real time you could see which lobes of the brain were responding to which stimulus, and which caused a lot and which caused a little. But the other thing was the paradigm shift. That's when they discovered that the brain had not wired itself by the time you were 5, but kept wiring itself until the day you died. See, this enormous paradigm shift of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. At the same time, you had an incredible tool. And so really now, almost everything written before 25 years ago in neurology is passé. The whole thing is reinventing itself. And fortunately and happily for media ecologists, now the empirical studies are demonstrating convincingly the kinds of things that we had observed for years. And so we just have to be careful not to say, I told you so.
I wonder if you could speculate a little bit on ebooks. And that's a big change that's come relatively recently and relatively quickly. What's the kind of thing we need to be on the lookout for in terms of how to think differently or not?
I have a little essay on my website about the Kindle. It's now dated because it's 3 years old. You know, 3 years is a millennium in technology. So I have a few thoughts there if you want to see my considered thoughts. Here I think what I would say is Depending upon the kind of reading you do, they seem to be very useful for many people. But Mortimer Adler persuaded me 30-some years ago to never read a book without a pencil. And my marginalia are just essential. It's what I do when I read a book, and 2 years later I'm trying to refresh myself. I go back and read the marginalia. And you don't have to do, I don't permit myself to have underscores, almost never permit myself underscores. Instead, right as I'm tempted to underscore it, I ask myself, why? Is it the person's thesis? And if so, I put a TH. If there's a very significant word that's going to recur, I put a D, definition. If he refers to a book that I think I want to read sometime, I put B, bibliography. If it's an extremely well-said thing, I put Q, quote. And then if I finish reading the book and some editor calls me and says, would you be willing to write a review of Sherry Turkle's book, this, that, and the other? I can put it together in a day, right? A really thoughtful review with lots of nice quotes because of the way I've written it. At this point, the annotation powers of the various electronic readers is still horrible. Everyone who tries to use them say it's so counterintuitive and difficult that it discourages annotation. But part of what I've learned a lot doing through the years is wise annotation. By the way, when you put it in the margin too, you can also take a pencil later and erase it. If you want the book to go to a used bookstore and have someone else do it. My first copy of C.S. Lewis's An Experiment Criticism, for instance, was used. And there weren't many marginalia, but the first thing I did is went through and erased them. I wanted it to be my book. But when you write it in ink, that's harder to do. And if you underscore it, it's a little harder to remove those. Marginalia are great. So they don't do too well for that. And I'm always nervous in church when I use my smartphone, because I've got a Greek text on it. So, by the way, the two best features of my smartphone are the Greek New Testament, and then watch this, the off button. It's a miracle. But sometimes if someone's preaching or giving a talk, and I just want to check the Greek, because you know the English translations they're great, they're wonderful. But sometimes taking one language into another just requires a trade-off. You just have to make a choice. So I always want to know, what does the original say? And so I sometimes just want to check something. But I always feel bad as that people think, well, he wants to know what's on his to-do list for tomorrow. He's checking Sports Illustrated's course. So I'm a little nervous about using them ecclesiastically. It wouldn't use them from the pulpit, by the way. And the reason there is because the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God will last forever. Right? So I think there's something about binding a Bible in a semi-permanent form that is a nice medium message thing. So in the pulpit, I wouldn't want to suggest ephemerality. Plus, there's also Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong, and the ecclesiastical addendum is even things that can't go wrong will go wrong. So I wouldn't want that. But I use digitized Hebrew and Greek texts literally almost all day long. I've been using the Accordance program since its beta version. And a couple of years ago, working on Galatians, the school even bought the Dead Sea Scrolls for me. So I had the Jewish pseudepigrapha in Greek, I had the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Greek Old Testament, the Apostolic Fathers in Greek. It's really wonderful. I consider so much stuff. And so for my work in biblical studies, I love having digitized texts. But I think in the public reading of the Word, ordinarily, it's nice to have a more permanent form for a permanent thing. There's that Cantos series by Cambridge Press that has reprinted a number of books from the 60s and 70s using the original plates. And they bound them in actual stitched paperback. But they're not cloth bound. They're still paperback. And someone borrowed and did not return my copy of Lewis's An Experiment in Criticism about a year and a half ago. And I finally found one in a used bookstore in Australia not too long ago and have another copy. I didn't want a paper-bound copy of this experiment in criticism. It needs to be cloth. So certain things, I think, it's the form and content, the medium and message. You're trying to find the most proper way of doing it. I know people who read World Magazine and U.S. News. They say they love having a tenure. Because for things that are like that are essentially ephemeral. I mean, the news is ephemeral. Which, if it goes back and reads World Magazine from 3 weeks ago, or the Boston Globe from yesterday. So I think for a more ephemeral reading, for stuff that just is here today and gone tomorrow, but it's probably great. But when they say we can carry hundreds of books with you at a time, I can't read but one at a time. So I really don't need 100 with me. I think I brought 2 with me today. I finally got around to reading Leland Ryken's Worldly Saints, the Puritans as they really were. And I also have a nice little collection about this big that has poems by Gray and Goldsmith and Pope, including the Dunciad. The Dunciad's in there. And what's this wonderful thing on the critics? Where he picks on the critics. What's it called?
Essay on criticism. Essay on criticism?
Yeah, I guess that's what it is. Yeah, Pope's essay on criticism. Yeah. So it's nice to have that. But that's all I need for a couple of days. Don't need much more.
You mentioned where we have printed materials, it encourages rationality, maybe at the expense of memory. So, as someone personally who is taken to writing lots of things down and not relying on memory so much, now I'm sort of wondering if you could just sort of comment on maybe the trade-off. I mean, rationality is all good, but losing memory and maybe neurologically the things that enables. I don't know if you have any comments on the trade-offs here.
Yeah, 2 things I want to make sure I forget. Something old and something new, the scribe of the kingdom. Something old, Socrates objected to writing, it's in the Phaedrus dialogue, that he objected to writing on 2 grounds, one of which was that you couldn't ask questions. You know, he's a big fan of dialogue. And he said to Themis, he said that your manuscript here, if I don't understand it and I ask it a question, it just repeats itself. And so that was one. But the other was his concern for memory. He said that, if the mind is not used to remember things, the capacity to remember will suffer. I think he was right on the second score and not as right on the first score, because a skilled writer can do what the Apostle Paul did, anticipate misunderstandings and say, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Of course not. So I don't think Socrates could foresee a circumspect writer anticipating objection and misunderstanding and heading it off. But on the memory part, I think he was largely correct. There's a little bit of a Faustian bargain. But now this is what's interesting, and I did use my fountain pen and wrote down it. It was very high-tech. In studies of recall, students who take lecture notes on a laptop computer and then are tested, and compared to those who hear the same lecture and take notes with a pen, the ones with the pen score 20 to 22 points higher. And that's because this is a very, very sophisticated activity when your brain and the neuromotor part of your brain teaches your fingers to make these tiny little characters. It's almost like brain surgery. It's just that we've done it for so long we forgot that when we started we had letters this big as children, right? Big loops and we go across the page, keep doing them, we do it. So what happens is, if you do an fMRI on someone who's working on a laptop, there's not much happening. The fingers are moving, but the mind is basically, oh, the retelling message all day. But when a person picks up a pen and takes notes, there's this explosion of neurological activity. And so, interestingly, the different form of writing you use is very, very significant in terms of recall. So quite often when I'm reading a book and I'm making my marginalia, and if I get the cues, I go back later and I have a little notebook of some sort out there somewhere, some kind of a little rodeo or a Noah Skinner or something like this. And I take out my pen and I go back and I just write down all the quotes just for me. And that helps me recall. Just the habit of writing does that. And so writing, oddly enough, can also serve the memory in certain ways. But keyboarding doesn't seem to do anything at all for it. So if I could ban laptops in my class, I would, both because it distracts students who don't use them. Did you know those figures from Canada? The Canadian figures are one group heard a lecture and was quizzed on it afterwards. That's the control group. The second group, half of them had laptops and the other half didn't. And they heard the same lecture. Those who were using their laptops scored 8% worse than those in the other class. But those who were not using the laptops scored 17% worse. It's more distracting to the person who's not using it than to the person who's using it. It's a little bit like when you're in a car on the passenger side, and someone gets a little uncomfortably close to the car in front of you, and you find yourself about to push through the floorboard. But the driver's going along just fine, because he or she knows they can hit the brake whenever they want. But you're a little nervous on the other side, or you can't do that. So apparently it's the same kind of thing. If you know you're checking Sports Illustrated scores during a scintillating Greek lecture, apparently it doesn't bother you too badly. But someone else wondering if you're checking Sports Illustrated scores is very distracting, right? So what I'd like to say is it's not fair to the people who are paying the full rate of the course to be distracted by the people who are using laptops. And none of them would remember the material as well as if they just took handwritten notes. But I tried to ban them and the administration wouldn't let me do it. So instead, on every syllabus that I produce every semester, I have a page of explanation of why I would ban them if I could. And a list of 40 or 50 or 60 universities and law schools that have banned them. And so the administration wins because I still have to permit the laptop, but I win because they have to read my syllabus every semester. And they have to see that I haven't given up the argument. So we both win. It's a Solomonic thing. I think I enjoy it more than they do.
Could you address, just from the ecology of things, the distinction between if the first ecology was really this idea of orality versus any pre-story, like pictures on caves, or where the picture comes, because certainly you're not saying that image is only visceral, because we know there's lots of rationality that has been developed over our art. I'm kind of mixing a whole bunch of thought that hopefully you can make sense of, because sometimes I think rationality and emotionality are like right brain and left brain, but that's not necessarily the lineup either.
Yeah, that's a great way of framing the question. By the way, make sure I get back to Socrates. I didn't complete the Socrates part of my answer to you, so make sure I get back to Socrates here in a minute too. When we talk about extensions of man, what we normally describe is the peculiar tendency of a given medium. And that is to say, certain media used in certain amounts are more likely to extend certain parts of our humanity. But it's not as though they will completely obliterate the other parts. It's just that they will tend to do this more easily than that. But yes, I doubt not that certain Cézanne paintings also cause us to think very seriously about hue and shape and light, and demand that we raise serious compositional questions. But, as I say, in terms of why the propagandists prefer them, it's because they can move your behavior without making a reason to harm.
Well, and just as a follow-on, certainly we're now even seeing medium of commercial where, you see a hotel commercial and there's nothing about the clean sheets. It's a boy in the woods and he's finding shelter in the cold, and so there's a connection that has no correlation to the product. It's about connection to a bigger idea, or rather, probably more accurately, an emotion of connection.
Yeah, it's making an emotional association. Right? But sometimes they are so obtuse that I still can't get it. Right? Every now and then you see one where you say, have you seen the one with James Earl Jones and this other actor where they stand up on this? That one's just going right by me.
Well, but somebody's getting it. Is it because they're less rational? I mean, obviously, if they're...
My students like it. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe so. By the way, the Socrates thing, how do you and I know that Socrates disagreed with writing?
Wrote it down.
No, his disciple Plato disagreed with him and wrote the Phaedrus dialogue. So it's one of the lovelier ironies in life. that had Plato not written it down, he wouldn't have known. So, the person who's written about that, by the way, Eric Havelock from Toronto, and then Harvard, and then Yale, though he's English, and now retired. But his book, Preface to Plato, is really not an introduction to his philosophy, but to his thoughts on media and why it differed from Socrates. And then he also wrote The Muse Learns to Write. Havelock also wrote The Muse Learns to Write. So for those of you interested in that particular era, Havelock probably was our primary thinker. And to a lesser degree, Walter Ong in St. Louis also wrote A Movement from Oral Cultures to Manuscript Cultures. It's really fascinating stuff.
I've heard said before that now we're moving from their era to Google era now. And so I realized that in a lot of ways that reading is really good for you, and I agree with that. But in a culture that is highly distracted by digital media and images and all, which all have their positive aspects to it, how do you reach to people who are so highly distracted in a way that makes them think, also connects to them in the thinking sense, as well as the motive sense? Because to help change a person is to address both the head and the heart to make that connection. So how do you reach a person who doesn't read, but is very connected to an image or to digital media?
Well, I think people are individuals who take them as they come and make a connection you can with them. But I probably have to admit, I'm just a little man and I cast a very small shadow. I have no plans to change the world. I'm leaving that to the last album. So I have very, very, very modest expectations about what little bit of good I might do before I'm dead. So I just don't assume the sort of almost messianic solution making that so many people do. How will we change this culture? I don't think it's impossible. It's not possible to change this culture. The commercial forces involved in image-based and digital media are more powerful than all the armies of the world put together. You can't stop it. All you hope is that as your tiny little shadow falls upon someone else, they might see some aspect of your life that's a little bit more symmetrical than theirs in some way, and they go, huh. I mean, sometimes that's all I can do. If I say to someone, when they say, what's wrong with you? You're weeping. And I said, I just read Birch again, Home Burial. And it's wonderful. We were at the Brahms and Dorsch's record in Pittsburgh 16 months ago. And early, the opening triple piano in the strings, but no violins. They don't play one note in the first 12 minutes per movie. But all big mahogany in the back, double string basses, cello, they're all going on. And I had to reach in my pocket and grab my handkerchief because even before the voices had come in, I knew where this was going. And I started to put my handkerchief back in my pocket. I said, well, I might need this again before the night's over. So I just left it on my lap, and I think I had to resort to it 2 or 3 other occasions briefly. Well, there were some Grove City students seated 3 rows behind us, as it were. And when the lights came up, one of them came up and says, Dr. Gordon, do you have a little cold? And I said, no, Rachel, I have a little Bronx. And she's in Colorado now, been gone for a year, and emailed recently to say she's fallen in love with this piece of music. So I think that's all we do. We commend what's good and beautiful and true by our own love for it.
That's great. Thank you. Keep going. That concludes our evening. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate you your attention very much. Have a good night.